It was the last week of camp. 5 girls and their 19-year-old sailing instructor were on a small sailboat in Biscayne Bay, Miami on the morning of July 28, 2025. The water was calm. The sky was clear. The girls were between 7 and 13 years old. They were wearing life jackets, every single one of them, because the sailing camp had rules about that, and the rules were followed. At 11:15 in the morning, the sailboat lost wind and stalled. It stalled in the path of a barge. The barge was enormous. It was loaded with construction debris. It was being pushed across Biscayne Bay by a tugboat called the Woodchuck. The tugboat captain could not see the sailboat. His forward view was blocked by the deckhouse and a crane mounted on the barge. Nobody on the barge had been assigned to watch for hazards in the water ahead. Nobody was looking. The captain's phone showed internet activity at or near the time of the collision. At 11:15 in the morning, the barge hit the sailboat. An 8-year-old girl on a nearby boat saw what happened. She described it afterward to CBS News. She said the crane just completely destroyed the boat. She said the boat went under. She said she heard one girl yell, "Help," from under the crane. The counselor and 2 of the girls were dragged under the barge. They escaped. 3 of the girls did not. Mila Yankelevich was 7 years old. Aaron Kohan was 13 years old. Ariel Buckman was 10 years old. It was the last week of camp. They were wearing their life jackets, and it didn't matter. Biscayne Bay is one of the most recognizable bodies of water in America. It sits between Miami and Miami Beach, a long, shallow lagoon that separates the city from the barrier islands along the Atlantic coast. The bay is studded with small islands, some of them barely more than sandbars, others home to some of the most expensive real estate in the world. Star Island, where the barge had been working that morning, is the kind of place where ritzy mansions look out over the water, and boats pass at all hours of the day. The bay is heavily trafficked. That is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. Biscayne Bay accommodates commercial shipping, recreational boating, fishing vessels, water taxis, kayakers, paddleboarders, Coast Guard vessels, and sailing camps. All of them sharing the same water. All of them operating under the assumption that everyone else on the water is paying attention. The Miami Youth Sailing Foundation has been running sailing camps in Biscayne Bay since 1927. Nearly a century of children learning to sail in the same waters. The camp is affiliated with the Miami Yacht Club, one of the oldest sailing institutions in South Florida. Their website describes the camp as operating in a quote-unquote very secure area of the bay. Children aged 7 to 15 spend their summers on the water, learning to read wind and current, learning to handle small boats, learning the skills that turn a child who's afraid of open water into someone who loves it. The crash happened between Hibiscus Island and Monument Island, a section of the bay that the sailing camp used regularly. Not a remote or unfamiliar stretch of water, a stretch that was part of the routine, a stretch the children had sailed many times. The Woodchuck and its barge were returning from Star Island, where waterfront construction had been demolishing a seawall. The barge was loaded with the debris from that job, pilings, construction waste, the physical remnants of a torn-down structure. The crane that would later destroy the sailboat was mounted on the barge's deck, its arm extending into the air above. 2 very different kinds of activity, sharing the same water at the same time on the same morning. One of them was a children's sailing camp in its final week of summer. The other was a commercial construction operation returning from a job. They should never have met the way they did. There were 5 girls on that sailboat. 3 of them died. 2 survived. Each of the 3 who died deserves to be known as more than just a name in a news report. Mila Yankelevich was 7 years old. She was the youngest. She was the daughter of television producer and director Tomas Yankelevich and actress Sofia Reka. Her grandparents were Chris Morena and Gustavo Yankelevich, two of the most prominent figures in Argentine entertainment. Chris Morena created some of Argentina's most beloved television programs, including Rebelde Way and Casi Angeles. The family lived between Surfside, Florida and Argentina. When the crash happened, her grandparents were in Argentina. They flew to Miami on Wednesday, 2 days after Mila died, to be with the family. Marcello Tinelli, one of Argentina's most famous television hosts and a close friend of the family, posted on social media that he was devastated. The Argentine consulate in Miami confirmed Mila's identity to Fox News. Her cause of death was confirmed by the Miami-Dade medical examiner as accidental drowning. Those who knew her described her as a joyful child. She loved dancing. She loved singing. She loved dressing up in costumes. She was 7 years old on the last Monday of July 2025. Erin Cohan was 13 years old. She was a Chilean national who had recently moved to the United States. She was at school in Miami, building a new life in a new country. Her school's director, Francisca Aburto, had known Erin before she became principal. She had been Erin's teacher in 5th and 6th grade. Erin left a mark that's indelible, Aburto said. While she was here, she was a light for us, for our school. Her former homeroom teacher, Paula Escobar, described her as a beautiful, happy, healthy girl who had her whole life ahead of her. Erin Cohan's cause of death was also confirmed by the medical examiner as accidental drowning. She was 13. She was new to the country. She was at a sailing camp in the final week of summer. Ariel Mazi Buckman was 10 years old. She did not die immediately. She survived the initial collision. She was pulled from the water. She was rushed to Jackson Memorial Hospital, one of Miami's main trauma centers. For days, she was in critical condition. Her family gathered, her community gathered. Her synagogue, Temple Menorah in Miami Beach, waited with her family. The former mayor of Bal Harbor, Gabrielle Groisman, confirmed her identity on social media on the saddest day in the Jewish calendar, Tisha B'Av, a day of mourning that commemorates the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. On the saddest day of the Jewish calendar, he wrote, my family mourns the loss of our 10-year-old cousin, Ariel. Temple Menorah announced her passing Sunday morning, saying, with broken hearts, we announce the funeral service of our beloved Ariel Mazi Buckman. The U.S. Coast Guard's commanding officer, Captain Frank Florio, confirmed her death in a statement, saying, quote, it is with a heavy heart that Coast Guard investigators announce the passing of the 10-year-old child that was in critical condition at Jackson Memorial Hospital. The child passed while surrounded by her immediate family. Ariel died 1 week after the crash. She was 10 years old. The two girls who survived the collision but were dragged under the barge were identified in legal filings. One was Kalina Ariane Gruber, 7 years old, who was released from the hospital days later. The other was a 9-year-old girl whose family filed a civil lawsuit on her behalf. It was, according to her attorney, Judd Rosen, her first day at the camp. Her first day. The 19-year-old counselor was also dragged under the barge and survived. A 12-year-old girl was evaluated after the crash but did not require hospitalization. She was safely pulled to shore. 6 people on that boat. 3 dead, 3 alive. The difference between those two groups was determined in minutes, by how they were positioned when the barge hit, by where the crane came down, by how far under the barge the water pulled them, and whether they could fight their way back out. They were all wearing life jackets. All of them. That detail has to be said again because it matters. These children followed the rules. They wore the equipment they were told to wear. They did everything they were supposed to do. And 3 of them still drowned in Biscayne Bay on a Monday morning in July. There were other children on the water that morning, other campers on other boats nearby who saw what happened. What they described afterward in their own words to CBS News journalists who spoke with them at the scene is the kind of account that is almost impossible to read without feeling the full weight of what those children witnessed and will carry for the rest of their lives. Enzo Pfeiffer Eddy was 9 years old. He describes the moment that the barge hit, saying, "There was a massive boat, and it hit one of the small sailboats. All of the kids went flying off. 2 were found quickly, and 3 had to go to the hospital." He was 9. That is what 9-year-olds remember from that morning. An 8-year-old girl who asked not to be identified was sailing nearby on what she called a wave sailboat when the crash happened. She gave the most detailed account of any witness. "The crane just completely destroyed the boat," she said. "The boat just went under. I heard one girl yell 'help' from under the crane. And 2 girls jumped off the wave, and the crane barely missed them." She heard a girl yell for help from under the crane. She was 8 years old. "It was super sad and super scary," she said. Those words from an 8-year-old girl are the most honest summary of what happened on Biscayne Bay that morning. Super sad and super scary. And she has to carry the memory of what she saw, the crane destroying the boat, the girl's voice from beneath it for the rest of her life. Not because she did anything wrong, not because she made any bad decision, simply because she was sailing on the same stretch of water at the same time. Surveillance video from the area captured the collision. It shows the barge striking the sailboat. It shows the sailboat going under. Investigators reviewed that footage. It became part of the criminal case. Uciel Lopez Insua was 46 years old on the morning of July 28, 2025. He was the captain of the Woodchuck, the tugboat pushing the barge loaded with construction debris across Biscayne Bay. He could not see ahead of him. That's not a figure of speech. The forward view from the tugboat's position was physically blocked. The deckhouse of the Woodchuck obstructed his sight line. The crane mounted on the barge extended both above and ahead. And the combination of those 2 structures meant that a person sitting in the captain's position and looking forward could not see a significant portion of the water in front of the barge as it moved through the bay. Federal maritime law has a specific response to this situation. When a vessel's forward view is obstructed, a lookout must be assigned. A dedicated person whose job is to watch the water ahead and communicate hazards to the captain. It is one of the most basic requirements in commercial maritime operations. It exists because captains cannot always see everything from where they sit. It exists to prevent exactly the kind of collision that happened on July 28th. No lookout had been assigned on the Woodchuck that morning. Nobody was watching. And then there's the phone. After the collision, federal investigators conducted a forensic review of Lopez Insua's cell phone. What they found was that the internet had been accessed on his phone around the time of the collision. Not before, not after, at or near the time. The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, Jason Redding Quinones, addressed this directly when announcing the charges, saying, "This information alleges a preventable loss of life on our waterways, including the failure to follow basic maritime safety rules and cell phone use during transit at or near the time of the collision." Preventable. That word in the mouth of a federal prosecutor is not rhetorical. It is the core of the legal theory behind the charge. The collision was preventable. The lives were preventable to lose. And the specific failures, no lookout, obstructed view, phone in use, made something preventable into something irreversible. Lopez Insua was charged with seaman's manslaughter, a federal charge that carries a maximum of 10 years in federal prison if he is convicted. As of the time this script was written, his case is moving through the federal court system. His attorney's response through the company's legal representative noted that all toxicology tests on everyone aboard the Woodchuck were negative. No drugs, no alcohol. The attorney argued that negligence requires more than the absence of alcohol, and that the case would turn on what exactly Lopez Insua knew and did in the moments leading up to the collision. That argument may be legally relevant. It does not change what happened to the three girls. The Woodchuck and the barge it was pushing were both registered to a company called Waterfront Construction. The company is owned by a businessman named Jorge Rivas. Waterfront Construction had been hired to demolish a seawall on Star Island, one of the exclusive private islands in Biscayne Bay, home to luxury estates and some of Miami's wealthiest residents. The work had been completed. The barge was loaded with the debris from that demolition. Pilings, construction materials, the physical evidence of a seawall that no longer existed. The Woodchuck and the barge were heading back across the bay when the collision occurred. The company's attorney, Lorenzo Palomares, gave a description of the conditions. The tug was doing 3.5 knots, a slow speed, he noted, consistent with careful navigation. He stated that the captain had been operating this barge for over 12 years, and that the mate who was meant to serve as lookout had been with the company for 8 years without major incidents. Now, that last detail is worth examining. The mate who was meant to serve as lookout had been with the company for 8 years. Not was serving as lookout, was meant to serve as lookout. According to the federal charging documents, nobody was actually assigned to that role that morning, despite 12 years of experience for the captain and 8 years for the mate. Whatever the policy was supposed to be, it was not being followed. The lawsuit filed on behalf of one of the surviving girls, the 9-year-old whose first day at camp this was, named both Waterfront Construction and 2 other parties, the Miami Yacht Club and the Miami Youth Sailing Foundation. The suit alleged that all 3 were, quote, careless, reckless, and negligent, and failed to take adequate measures to avoid the collision. Attorney Judd Rosen, who filed the suit, framed it precisely, saying, "Both of these vessels are slow-moving. The barge and sailboats don't go at high rates of speed. That tells you right there this accident doesn't happen without negligence." He is describing simple geometry: a slow barge and a small sailboat. One of them was not watching. The other had no ability to get out of the way fast enough once they stalled. The Miami Youth Sailing Foundation has existed since 1927, nearly a century of teaching children to sail in Biscayne Bay. It's affiliated with the Miami Yacht Club, a respected institution in South Florida's sailing community. The camp accepts children from 7 to 15 years old. It runs through the summer, and the week of July 28th was the final week of the 2025 season. The sailing camp was named in the civil lawsuit alongside Waterfront Construction. The specific allegation is that the camp failed to take adequate measures to avoid the collision. And what that means in practical terms, whether it relates to the route that the sailboat was sailing, the supervision of the instructor, the emergency protocols in place, or something else entirely, is a matter that the civil litigation will explore. The camp's response after the tragedy was one of grief, not defensiveness. The Miami Yacht Club spokesperson Lisa Muslim issued a series of statements saying, "The Miami Yacht Club and the Miami Youth Sailing Foundation are deeply heartbroken to share that a 3rd young sailor has tragically passed away," she said after Ariel Buckman died. "This devastating news comes after 2 young sailors lost their lives in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy. Now, with the passing of a 3rd sailor, the entire sailing community is shattered by grief." The sailing community extended offers of counseling and mental health support to the children who witnessed the crash and to the families of those who died. What the sailing camp knew, what it should have known, and what protocols were or were not in place for operating in a bay that carries commercial traffic alongside recreational vehicles, those are questions that the civil case will pursue. Those questions have not been publicly answered at the time that this script was written. What we do know is this: A 19-year-old counselor was responsible for 5 children aged 7 to 13 on a small sailboat in a waterway that also carries commercial barges. She was barely out of childhood herself. She did not cause this collision. She survived it, and she helped others survive it. But the question of whether adequate safeguards were in place, whether someone with more maritime experience or with better communication equipment or with better protocols for handling a stalled boat in a commercial waterway should have been on that boat, is a question that the courts will answer. When the collision happened, the response was immediate. Miami Beach Fire Rescue was first on scene. They were joined by rescue crews from Miami, Miami-Dade, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and the U.S. Coast Guard. Multiple agencies converged on Biscayne Bay within minutes of the collision. All 6 people on the sailboat were pulled from the water. 4 children were rushed to the hospital. A 7-year-old and a 13-year-old were pronounced dead on arrival. A 10-year-old was placed in critical condition. A 7-year-old was treated and later released. The counselor and a 12-year-old were evaluated but did not require hospitalization. Salvage operations to recover the submerged sailboat began the following day. Coast Guard Sector Miami Commander Captain Frank Florio became the public face of the response. A difficult role to occupy, delivering updates that grew progressively worse over the following week. He confirmed the life jackets. He confirmed the testing of the captain. He confirmed the referral to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation. He said, addressing the families directly, quote, "Know that we grieve with you. We will not take this lightly, and we will not forget. We owe you answers, and we are committed to finding them." That commitment, public, explicit, on record, matters. Investigations of maritime incidents involving commercial vessels can take months to complete. The Coast Guard's investigation ran from late July through October before the referral to the Department of Justice. The criminal charge was filed by federal prosecutors in April of 2026, nearly 9 months after the crash. 9 months. That's a long time for families to wait. It's not an unusual timeline for federal maritime investigations of this complexity, but 9 months is a long time to know that your child died and not yet know whether anyone will be held accountable for it. The criminal charge against Lopez Insua is an important piece of accountability, but it also answers a narrow question. Did this specific captain, on this specific morning, operate his vessel negligently? It does not answer the wider question that the collision raises about Biscayne Bay itself. Biscayne Bay is used simultaneously and without physical separation by children in sailing camps and commercial construction barges, by recreational kayakers and large commercial vessels, by water taxis and fishing boats and private yachts and Coast Guard ships and tugboats pushing debris-laden barges between job sites. All of that activity coexists on the same water without designated lanes, without mandatory separation of commercial and recreational traffic in zones where children's activities routinely occur, and without a requirement that commercial vessels operating near known children's programs take additional precautions. The 9-year-old's attorney Judd Rosen identified the core of the problem precisely when he noted that slow-moving vessels in the same waterway should have been able to see each other in time to avoid a collision. And he's right. The question that does not yet have a clean answer is, why didn't they? The answer, based on what has been made public, appears to be a combination of 3 things. The barge's captain could not see forward because of the physical obstruction of the deckhouse and the crane. No lookout was assigned to compensate for that obstruction, and the captain's phone was in use at or near the time. Each of those 3 things is an individual failure by a specific person, but together they also point to a system question. Commercial vessels with obstructed forward visibility are required to carry lookouts under maritime law. That requirement existed precisely because someone, at some point, recognized that obstructed visibility plus no lookout equals a collision waiting for the right moment. The law was already there. The requirement was already there. It was not followed on that morning. If it had been followed, a person assigned specifically to watch the water ahead would have seen a small sailboat stalled in the path of a barge with enough time for the captain to slow or steer. 3 children might be alive. That is the systemic failure, not the absence of a law, the absence of enforcement of a law that already existed. Now, we want to be clear about what we think happened here, and also what we think the most important questions still are. What we think happened is straightforward. A commercial tugboat operator who could not see forward in a crowded waterway, a limitation that federal maritime law specifically requires to be compensated for by assigning a lookout, was operating without that lookout and with his phone in use. A children's sailing camp boat stalled in his path, he didn't see it, the barge hit it, and 3 girls died. That's the core of it. It's a story of individual negligence enabled by the absence of the most basic safety check. One specific person on watch whose job was to look at the water and simply say, "Stop." Now, what we think the most important remaining questions are the following. First, what does the Seaman's manslaughter trial establish about exactly what Lopez Insua was doing on his phone, and whether the court finds that his phone use contributed directly to the collision? The federal charge is filed, but the case has not been heard. The outcome of that case matters not just for this family, but for every commercial maritime operator who makes decisions about how to manage obstructed visibility and phone use while navigating a busy waterway. Second, what does the civil litigation establish about the sailing camp's own protocols, and whether those protocols were adequate for operating in a waterway that carries commercial traffic? The lawsuit named the Miami Yacht Club and the Youth Sailing Foundation alongside waterfront construction. That is a broader accountability question than just the criminal charge addresses. And third, does this collision produce any regulatory change for how commercial and recreational traffic share Biscayne Bay? The criminal charge punishes one person for one morning's failures. It does not change the conditions that made those failures lethal rather than just negligent. A lookout who had been doing his job that morning would have prevented the collision. The question is whether something beyond the charge against Lopez Insua changes the likelihood that the next barge moving through a waterway shared with children's sailing camps will have a proper lookout assigned to it. We do not know the answers to those questions yet. The trial has not been scheduled. The civil case is in its early stages. No regulatory changes to Biscayne Bay's commercial recreational traffic management have been publicly announced. What we know is what the federal prosecutor said: preventable. The loss of 3 children's lives was preventable. Not by extraordinary measures, not by sophisticated technology, by following a rule that already existed. One person watching the water ahead. The Miami Youth Sailing Foundation has been teaching children to sail in Biscayne Bay since 1927. Nearly a century. Generations of children who learn to read the wind and the water, and then come home with salt in their hair and something new in their understanding of the world. The summer of 2025 ended differently. Mila Yankelevich was 7 years old. She loved dancing, singing, and dressing up in costumes. Her grandparents flew from Argentina to be with the family. She's gone. Erin Cohan was 13 years old. She had recently moved to the United States. She was a light for her school, her teacher said. The mark she left was indelible. She is gone. Ariel Mazi Buckman was 10 years old. She died on Tisha B'Av, the saddest day in the Jewish calendar, surrounded by her immediate family at Jackson Memorial Hospital. Her synagogue announced her funeral with broken hearts. She is gone. The criminal case against Yusiel Lopez Insua is working its way through the federal court system. The civil lawsuit is in its early stages. The Coast Guard concluded its investigation and has now referred the matter to the Department of Justice. The families are waiting for the proceedings to run their course. Somewhere in Miami, the children who witnessed the crash from nearby boats on July 28, 2025, the 9-year-old boy, the 8-year-old girl who heard a voice from under the crane, they're living with what they saw. They're a year older now. They have not forgotten. None of this should have happened. That's the simplest and truest way to say it. 3 girls were on a sailboat wearing their life jackets in the last week of summer camp. They did everything right. And a man pushing a barge across the same water without anyone watching what was ahead of him did not see it. The life jackets were on, the lookout was not. That is the whole story and the whole tragedy in 2 sentences. Now, if you know this story and you feel the weight of it, make sure to share this video. These 3 girls deserve to be remembered beyond the news cycle that moved on from them in August of 2025. And if you have thoughts or additional information about the civil case or the criminal trial, make sure to leave them in the comments. We're going to monitor this case and then we're going to return to it when the trial date's set. Subscribe so that you're here when we do.